Hi, this is Cathy Moore, and I've got Leif Cederblom from SmartBuilder on the line. A while ago, Leif and Rob Penn were showing me how their SmartBuilder tool can be used to build branching scenarios. And they showed me a sort of before and after prototype that I thought you should see, because it's a great example of how you can use prototyping to show stakeholders that a realistic scenario is much more effective than the typical quiz or game. So, Leif, what was the activity supposed to help learners do?
Well, let me pull up the document that we were provided. This was for a biological lab working with airborne pathogens. So this is a very serious issue for exiting and hand washing standard operating procedure. In other words, how are they not going to leave the lab with any airborne pathogens, on their person? So they had a working document that was really just an outline of the steps. So each step has a number, and then we have a graphical representation of that step here on the right. This was what they had been working off of, and they wanted to create an e-learning module for this topic.
And then you started out deciding to do a prototype. So what are your sort of guidelines for a prototype?
Good question, because that is pretty key. So in terms of prototyping, as you mentioned, I think you hit on something key. The prototypes are really they become an artifact to help the conversation with stakeholders and subject matter experts for designing better e-learning. And so there's some principles you can follow when prototyping to increase your success. And the first one I'm going to mention is probably the most important, and it's that they should be quick, dirty, and incomplete. Prototypes are not meant to be fully functioning exercise that shows all the possible options and whatnot. It's supposed to be something you quickly put together so that you can show somebody, and it really facilitates conversation at that point. So it becomes an artifact you can kind of have as a really solid thing to talk around. The focus of the prototype should be on learner experience, not on content. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the principles that when I talk about learner experience, things you can aim for. But really, it's this: we're not worried about what do the graphics look like, what is the text, is the text complete, are we just really the accuracy of the content is not our primary concern. It's really the learner experience. And this process is meant to be something that's iterative. So we're going to design a prototype, then build it out very quickly, review it with stakeholders, and then based on the feedback we get from those stakeholders, revise the prototype and do that as many times, go through the cycle as many times as necessary to come up with something that we're satisfied with. And in terms of the actual review process, you want to include not just your subject matter experts and stakeholders. It's good to have a wide audience that would include people such as recent learners. Really, the more wide an audience you have in terms of people feeding in ideas, the better your ideas are going to be. And the other key thing for the prototype review process is that you really want to try and condense it. If you space it out too much over time, then the learning experiences that happen between the iterations are kind of lost. And then you spend your time explaining what the changes were and why, rather than just kind of focusing on the prototype itself. So really it's something you want to try and condense into a couple of days rather than spreading it out over a couple weeks. So those are really those are the rules we would try to follow when prototyping.
In my experience, too, it helps to have a small team reviewing the prototype rather than having to send it around to a large number of people.
Agreed.
So if you could get a small representative team. And the first thing you showed me was sort of what you call the straw man prototype. So what did that look like?
Yeah, let me pull that up. So given that we have a process that looks like this, where it's a very linear process, the typical exercise that people think of as, okay, well, let's give them steps, and we're going to then come in and drag this step over to the process. Okay, and so now and we're going to kind of keep dragging these until we get them right, and I will speed up a little bit since I do know the right answers here. But basically, dragging the right answer over and kind of placing it in the right order. Let me see. So we're going to.
So this is an activity that a lot of people would recognize from a lot of different e-learning materials.
Exactly.
And so how would you evaluate this activity?
Well, and we get some positive feedback. Like you said, it feels very similar to God knows how many exercises this could be applied to. When building prototypes and really kind of what we want our exercise to look like, and this is something that, frankly, knowing a bit about your blog, I think a lot of your audience is already hip to these concepts, but it's relevant to circle back around and point them out specifically. If we can build an exercise that is relevant, it has a realistic scenario, basically it's contextually relevant to our daily activities, the things that we need to do to perform our job well, we're going to increase our likelihood of success. If we can make the decisions the learner is having to make in that learning exercise meaningful, in other words, they represent the real-world decisions they have to make, and there's challenge to it. It's not just there's some challenge to the exercise that again increases our likelihood of being successful. And then feedback. Basically how in the real world would someone know if they were doing this, performing this activity correct or incorrectly, and then how do we represent that feedback in the learning? The more we can make our feedback similar to real-world feedback, again, that increases our likelihood of success. So if we look at these three key criteria and we evaluate them against this exercise here, so again, realistic scenario, meaningful decision-making, meaningful feedback, is this a realistic scenario? It doesn't really look like the real world. Is this necessarily challenging? Not really.
Do they do a drag and drop on the job when it's time to do the lab?
Exactly. So it's and then the feedback here. Perhaps we could implement the feedback to be more constructive than just a red X, but it's really still not reflecting the real world task. So again,
or the real world consequences. Yeah.
Yes, or the real world consequences. So it's really that exercise doesn't hit these three key criteria.
So what did you do instead?
So what did we do instead? We built an exercise, and this is really the real prototype here, where you need to leave the lab.